Hey everybody, it's Steve, and this is going to be the second class in our series on the Antichrist. Haven't been able to record lately because I had an audio issue with my microphone, and so I've been kind of gathering up the classes, and I'm going to start working on them now and getting them out. I've had, I believe, 3 classes since I had stopped recording at the church, so hoping to try and catch those up here today and maybe tomorrow. See how much I get to today. And so this is the second week. And in the first class, we began a review of just the major eschatological systems, or the end times views that are in the church. This is within the body of Christ. And we talked about Pre-Millennialism. We talked about Post-Millennialism and Amillennialism, and we're going to get into those in more detail as the classes go on, just trying to get a general overview so that you got an idea of where these views fit in. And it's important to understand these, when we're talking about pre, post, and amillennialism, we're talking about the relationship of the return of Jesus Christ to the earth to the millennium. Where does the return of Christ fit in with the millennium? In the premillennial view, Jesus comes to earth before the beginning of the millennium. And so that's why it's called premillennialism. In postmillennialism, obviously, the millennium comes before the return of Jesus Christ to the earth. So they believe, again, and we'll get into that, that is a different understanding of the millennium, much different from the premillennial view. But in that view, Jesus does not return to earth until after the millennium, and it's the same in amillennialism. That is a much different view of the nature of the millennium, but still the return of Jesus Christ to the earth is after the millennium. And so don't get that confused with pre-tribulation or mid-tribulation or post-tribulationalism. That's a totally different situation. That has to do with the relationship of the rapture to the tribulation or the Great Tribulation. And so they're similar because you got the pre and the post, but they're different things. And so pre-tribulationalism means that the rapture takes place prior to the tribulation. The church will be raptured, and then there will be a tribulation. Mid-trib teaches that there's going to be a rapture in the middle of the tribulation. We're going to talk more about these views a little more in depth here over the next couple of weeks. And then post-tribulationalism is that the church goes through the entire tribulation, and then is the rapture and return of Christ at that time. So different times, different theology that we're dealing with. We're talking about the millennium or the rapture, tribulation. Don't get those two confused. And so we began talking about premillennialism, and over the next 3 weeks, I've spent 3 weeks just talking about varieties of premillennialism, different views within the premillennial camp in the church. And it's not just one view, or there's not just one view. There's quite a few different views in the church that has to do with premillennialism. And so that is, again, after Jesus returns to earth, he will bind Satan. He's going to set up his kingdom on this earth, and there will be a literal millennial kingdom on the earth for 1,000 years. Jesus will reign for 1,000 years. This is going to be a time of unprecedented peace and prosperity, righteousness in the earth, incredible unity on the earth. Everything really that we hope for in the present is going to be realized at that time. And so that's the understanding of the premillennial view. And within the premillennial camp, we began to talk about dispensationalism and classic or traditional dispensationalism. And let's make sure we understand what is dispensationalism. I realized my wife kind of talked to me afterward and helped me to realize that these words, not everybody's familiar with these words. And so I thought I'd take a little bit of time just to explain a little bit of these words. I have a book here from Renald Showers called There Really Is a Difference. And this is a comparison of covenant and dispensational theology. He is a traditional dispensationalist. And he gives a definition. Dispensational theology can be defined very simply as a system of theology which attempts to develop the Bible's philosophy of history on the basis of the sovereign rule of God. So it's trying to understand all of history under the rule of God, coming up with a philosophy of how God has ruled this entire history of the earth. And so it represents the whole of Scripture and history as being covered by several dispensations of God's rule. And so there are, according to the dispensationalists, there are several different ways God has ruled in the earth from the beginning until the end. And those are dispensations. Those are the different dispensations. That is why it's called dispensationalism. In traditional dispensational theology, there are seven dispensations. The first is the dispensation of innocence, or innocency. And this goes from the time of the creation until the fall. And then you have the second dispensation is the dispensation of conscience. And that goes from the fall of man to the flood in the time of Noah. That begins a new dispensation, the dispensation of human government. And that comes from the flood till the time of Abraham. And then that starts a new dispensation, the dispensation of promise, from Abraham to Mount Sinai. When Israel's brought out of Egypt and they come to Mount Sinai, this starts a new dispensation, the dispensation of the Mosaic Law. This is the time of the law. From Sinai to the crucifixion of Jesus Christ is the dispensation of law. And that begins a whole new dispensation. This is the dispensation of grace. And this is from the crucifixion to the return of Jesus Christ. This is the age in which we currently live, the church age, the dispensation of grace. That will end with the return of Christ, the binding of Satan, and will begin the dispensation of the millennium. And that is the millennial kingdom. That is the final dispensation. And these are different ways God rules over the earth, different ways that God administers his rule on the earth during different times and dispensations. So when I say dispensationalism, it's a little difficult, I understand, but that's the general view. If you want a good understanding, this is a decent book. Obviously, it's coming from that perspective. You can get an idea. I think I put up a book last week from Paul Ben Ware on prophecy, and that one's another one that you can read, and he goes through the dispensations on there. And there's a lot of books. Charles Ryrie has written a book and revised it multiple times on dispensationalism that is really helpful in that regard. So those are some of the things you can look at if you want to dig into that further. But that is what a dispensationalism is. The key distinctive, the really important thing from the traditional dispensational view is the distinction between Israel and the church. We talked about this in the first class, that God has two distinct people. And in traditional dispensationalism, they are distinct in their plans, their purposes of God. He has an earthly people, Israel, and a heavenly people, the church. And so they have two plans, two destinies, two distinct peoples. And this is, Charles Ryrie called it, this is the, I don't even know how to say the Latin word, the sine qua non, or that which you cannot do without. This is the defining doctrine of dispensationalism. The distinction, a sharp, strong distinction between Israel and the church. And so Israel, in this view, refers to the nation of ethnic Jews descended from Abraham through Isaac and Jacob. These are the Jewish people. The church is a multi-ethnic body that began on the day of Pentecost. And so when we talk about Israel and the church, that's what we're talking about. Israel is the Jewish nation descended from Abraham through Isaac and Jacob. The church is a multi-ethnic body of believers from all nations, all tribes, all people that started on the day of Pentecost. The church, in this understanding, does not replace Israel, does not receive Israel's promises, does not fulfill Israel's promises. The church is separate, distinct from Israel. The church is not spiritual Israel, true Israel, or new Israel. The church is not Israel in any sense, and in a traditional dispensational understanding. And from the time of Abraham to the time of Christ, God was bringing his salvation and blessings to the world through the nation of Israel. From Abraham to Christ, when the Jewish nation, they were offered the kingdom in this view. Jesus came and offered the kingdom. The kingdom is at hand. He's telling them, repent and believe the kingdom, enter the kingdom of God. They rejected as a nation. Now there's a remnant that believed, but as a nation, overall, the Jewish nation rejected Jesus as Messiah and rejected his kingdom. And so God has set them aside, but not forever. This is a temporary thing. God has set aside the Jewish nation, and he has hardened the Jewish nation. And they are presently hardened, being hardened by God because of their rejection of the Messiah. He has set them aside, and he has raised up the church. And according to the dispensational, the traditional view, the church is not prophesied in the Old Testament. It is not it's a mystery. It was not foreseen. This was something that God did that was not expected. And so the church is a mystery that came into existence when Israel rejected the kingdom. So God is using the church now to bring his salvation and blessings to the world. This is the dispensation of grace, the church age. Israel has been set aside, and God is now working through the church and bringing his salvation and blessing to the world. But God is not through with the nation of Israel. And this is very important because when you get to the millennium and understanding the tribulation from this view and understanding the rapture, it all has to do with Israel and the church. We talked about this last week, so I won't go too much into it, or the last time I recorded. Since the day of Pentecost, the church is God's focus, and he will continue to use the church until he takes the church out of the world in the rapture. When God takes the church out of the world in the rapture, he will then focus back to Israel. And so that's kind of where we left off. And that's what I want to talk about today, the rapture, the Antichrist, the Great Tribulation, the return of Jesus Christ from the traditional dispensational viewpoint. And you all are familiar with this view because it is by far the prominent view of our age. It is pre-tribulationalism. If you're familiar with Left Behind, Hal Lindsey, John Hagee, Jack Van Impe, and many, 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 many more, this is the doctrine which they have taught and preached, and which they have done an incredible job of spreading all over the earth. It is well known everywhere. And this is the view of the Assemblies of God, which is what I'm a part of. I am a member of an Assemblies of God church. They are dispensational pre-trib in their understanding of the end times. And so this view is basically, at the end of the church age, Jesus is going to descend from heaven, but this is important, he's not going to come all the way back to earth. This is a descent into the heavens where he will resurrect all the saints who have died up until that point, and he is going to rapture all the saints who are alive at the time. They will meet the dead and meet the dead and the living saints transformed and have their glorified bodies. They will meet the Lord in the air, and then Jesus is going to take his church out of here back to heaven for 7 years. The church is going to be completely removed from the earth. No Christians left on the earth. Every single believer will be taken out of this earth and back to heaven with Jesus. This is the rapture. This is a pre-tribulation rapture. And this is going to be a 7-year period. With the church removed from the earth now, in this understanding, God is going to refocus his attention on the nation of Israel and the Jewish people. What a lot of people don't understand, this entire viewpoint developed within this entire system. And so a pre-trib rapture is very closely tied to an understanding of Israel and the church, a sharp distinction between the two. It plays into the whole thing. And so the church removed, God's going to focus again on the nation of Israel. Sometime after the rapture, it may be right away, probably will be a little bit of time, there's going to be a world leader who is going to sign a covenant or a peace treaty basically to protect the nation of Israel. He's going to promise his protection to the Israelite nation, the Jewish nation. And this is the revealing of the Antichrist. This is the Antichrist. This is how he makes himself known, according to this view. When he signs a 7-year treaty with Israel, the Antichrist has been revealed. This is the beginning of the Great Tribulation. In this view, this understanding of this view. Now we're going to talk about different views that have much different views of how this all works out, but this is the traditional dispensational view. The church removed, God back to Israel. The Antichrist, or at that point he's not known as the Antichrist. People are not aware of who he is. He's a world leader. He signs a covenant of peace, a treaty with the nation of Israel. This begins the Great Tribulation. During the Great Tribulation, the wrath of God is poured out on the earth. When you read the book of Revelation, you read about the 7 seals, the 7 trumpets, and the 7 bowls, or 7 bowls, 7 trumpets. I forget the order they go in. But these are the wrath of God in this view. They understand this to be the wrath of God. And this 7-year period is the time where those things that we read about in the book of Revelation are happening on the earth. The church is out of here. Church is not destined for wrath. The church has been taken away. The wrath now comes, and it's the entire 7-year period is the wrath of God, the day of the Lord, the outpouring of the wrath of God on the earth. And so this is a time of suffering, of terrible destruction, of judgment on the earth. And so this is also a time of revival among the Jewish people. The entire 7-year period, most dispensationalists view it as this period is God preparing the nation of Israel for the millennium. And so this is a time specifically where Israel is the focus of attention. Now, I mentioned earlier that once the rapture takes place, God is going to remove the hardening from Israel. Well, where does that come from? Let me just read you a verse from the book of Romans, chapter 11, verse 25. Paul says, "For I do not want you, brethren, to be uninformed of this mystery, so that you will not be wise in your own estimation, that a partial hardening has happened to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in." See, Israel has been hardened while God deals with the church, or here it's the Gentiles. Until the fullness happens. So at this point, we're talking at the end of the church age, the Gentiles have come in. The fullness of the Gentiles come in. The church has been raptured, Jew and Gentile. The church has been raptured, and now God is going to remove that hardening, that partial hardening on Israel. As Paul says, and so all Israel will be saved. And so this is understood that during this 7-year tribulation, there's going to be a spiritual awakening among the Jewish people. And after the rapture, God's going to undo this hardening. He's going to once again have mercy on the Jewish people. And there's going to be people coming to Jesus. There's going to be a great multitude coming to Jesus. And from the traditional dispensational view, Revelation 7, you have this 144,000 from the tribes of Israel. These are Jewish evangelists who have gotten saved, who have come to Jesus in the tribulation. They are now going out into the world and preaching the gospel. God is once again focusing his work through Israel. And so you have Jewish evangelists going all over the world, and then there's a great multitude, it says in the second part of Revelation, standing before the throne. These are they who have come out of the Great Tribulation, who have washed their robes. These are people who have gotten saved during this 7-year period, probably from the Jewish evangelists. There's 2 witnesses in Revelation, probably they're being used of God. And so this is understood as there's a great spiritual awakening in the midst of the wrath of God being poured out on the earth. And so this is the understanding from the traditional dispensational viewpoint. Halfway through this Great Tribulation, which is about 3.5 years, the Antichrist is going to break his covenant with the nation of Israel. He is going to set up himself in God's temple. This is an important part of the classical traditional dispensationalism. The temple must be rebuilt in Jerusalem on the Temple Mount where the Dome of the Rock currently stands. The temple will be rebuilt. The Antichrist is going to set himself up and declare himself God in the temple and commit the abomination of desolation at that point. About halfway through the tribulation. This really is going to intensify the suffering at the last 3.5 years. So the final 3.5 years is the worst suffering on the earth, because the Antichrist is now going to turn his attack against the Israelis and against the church, those who have come to Christ. This is a time of Jacob's trouble, is one of the scriptures calls it. And so there's going to be great suffering for the Jewish people, martyrdom, persecution. The Antichrist is going to break his treaty with Israel and turn against them. And he's going to attack, and he's going to seem to win. There's going to be this false prophet. They're going to be performing false signs and wonders. There's going to be the mark of the beast happening at this time, where you have to take this mark to buy and sell, to have food. You have the followers of the Antichrist will take the mark, but those who don't will be under his persecution, his attack. And so this is going to be worldwide, and this is the last 3.5 years is really a time of terrible suffering for any believer, Jewish, Christian, or non-Jewish at that point. This is a time of the Great Tribulation. And so as this period goes on, as it gets close to the end, the Antichrist is going to gather a massive army against Jerusalem. And they're going to march on the Jewish nation to destroy and wipe out the Jewish people. This is the Battle of Armageddon. They have gathered their armies. They're surrounding the city. And then Jesus is going to split the skies. This is the return of the Lord to the earth. 7 years after the rapture, Armageddon, the Battle of Armageddon has come. The Jewish people are surrounded. They're under attack. Jesus comes from the sky with his saints, his heavenly army, and his holy angels. And he comes down and destroys the Antichrist and his armies. Jesus is going to deliver the nation of Israel at that time and wipe out the ungodly and wipe out the Antichrist and kill and destroy and the false prophet and all those who have followed him and had the mark on them. They're going to be judged as Jesus returns to the earth. And this is when Jesus now sets up his kingdom in Jerusalem. He's going to step down on the Mount of Olives, set up his kingdom on the earth from Jerusalem. He is going to rule for 1,000 years. This goes into the millennial reign of Jesus Christ. This is a time, again, and this is important. What is the millennium from this understanding? The millennium is a time where God fulfills his promises to the nation of Israel. All the promises that God made throughout to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, all the way through with Noah and Moses and David, and as it goes on and on through the Old Testament, God made promises that include the land, the Palestine, that include the blessing and incredible passages. These are going to be fulfilled during the millennium. The millennium is the time where God fulfills his promises to the Jewish people. And so this is the restoration of the kingdom. Remember, when Jesus had died and been crucified, he rose again, and for 40 days he appeared and spoke with his disciples. In Acts chapter 1, they ask him, "Are you at this time going to restore the kingdom to Israel?" And Jesus said, "It is not for you to know that. That's not the times and dates, but you are to go and preach the gospel." See, Jesus didn't say, there is no kingdom for Israel. I'm not going to restore the kingdom to Israel. The millennium is that time where the kingdom is restored to Israel. It's very Jewish-centered, Jewish-focused from the traditional dispensational understanding. And so this is what the millennium is, and that is the dispensational pre-millennial view, traditional dispensational pre-millennial view of the end times, of how it's all going to play out. That's the most popular, the most well-known. TV preachers, it's all over the place. Somehow it was adopted early by Pentecostal denominations. It's kind of known as the Pentecostal view by many. Many Pentecostals hold this view. And so that is it for this this second class. And next week I'm going to be talking to you about a couple other views We've got the historic premillennialism and the progressive dispensationalism. And those are going to be talked about next week. And the week after that, I'm saying week, but it's really just the classes after that. We'll be talking to you about mid-tribulationalism and the pre-wrath rapture of the church view. And those are all the premillennial understandings. Within the premillennialism, these are all part of that view. And so we'll pick that up from there and see you in the next class.